This is the female serial killer case that shocked all of South Korea. Before killing each woman, the murderer would dig a large pit on a hillside in advance. After assaulting those innocent girls, she would then cruelly bury them alive. She thought her practice methods would never fail, but this time, something unexpected happened. Just as she opened the trunk, she had no idea that the girl had already used a tool to cut through the rope and struck her with it. Taking advantage of the killer's pain, the girl, barefoot, ran desperately down the mountain without looking back. But the killer, who had already committed more than 20 murders, how could she let her escape so easily? The girl thought that if she ran into the residential area at the foot of the mountain, she would be safe, so she quickly climbed over the fence and called for help from the residents. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, no matter how loudly she screamed for help, she couldn't wake up Junior, who was fast asleep. Old Han, who lived on the 6th floor, had just finished a company dinner. He was about to relax with a beer when he suddenly heard a girl scream from downstairs. When he went out onto the balcony, he saw that the woman who had just been running for her life was already badly injured, and the killer was chasing after her, swinging something hard at her head. Seeing that the woman was about to be beaten to death, Old Han quickly took out his phone and immediately called the police. However, it was precisely because of his wife that this sudden incident shattered their once happy and peaceful life. Although Old Han quickly turned off the lights, he still caught the killer's attention. To avoid alarming his family, Old Han kept the incident from his wife and reassured her to go back to sleep. Then he quietly snuck back onto the balcony himself, but as soon as he poked his head out, he found himself making direct eye contact with the killer. He quickly moved behind a flower pot, then peeked down again through a gap, only to see the killer counting the floors before heading toward the building. Realizing that the situation was dire, Old Han grabbed the bat hanging on the wall and stood guard at the door, fully prepared to confront the killer head-on. He was determined not to let any harm come to his wife and daughter. However, after standing guard at the door for over an hour, he never heard any movement outside. When he cautiously poked his head out, he found the quiet corridor completely empty. Just as he thought he could finally go to sleep in peace, a hand suddenly reached in from outside. It turned out that Old Han never actually dared to open the door. It was all just a nightmare. As he gasped for breath, he made a cowardly yet helpless decision. Due to the flaws and inaction of the Korean judicial system, people who report crimes often face retaliation from the perpetrators. Considering his family's safety, Old Han decided to bury the incident deep in his heart and pretend he hadn't seen anything. However, what he didn't know was that the girl wasn't actually dead, and the killer lurking in the shadows had never left. The killer's goal was to eliminate any witnesses who might come down to help. He waited until 4 in the morning, but still, no witness came down to help. So the killer took the girl's phone and then struck her several more times with brutal force. After dawn, a nervous Old Han looked out from his home toward the crime scene, repeatedly checking to see if the killer had seen him the night before, completely unaware that someone had secretly taken his photo. From then on, Old Han began living in constant fear. First, he received calls from unknown numbers for 2 days in a row. No matter how many times he asked, he never heard a response from the other end. Then he discovered that his family's dog had gone missing. He and his wife went downstairs to look for it, not realizing that the killer was secretly watching them, seemingly planning how to silence them for good. Meanwhile, on the police side, after repeatedly interviewing residents of the neighborhood, they learned that a little girl had heard cries for help at 2 o'clock in the morning on the night of the incident. But just as the bald officer was about to ask more questions, the girl's mother immediately interrupted the conversation.
I have a method.
Hey, let me tell you something. Facing the receipt.
The veteran detective was used to the residents' indifference. In South Korea, with its weak legal system and no death penalty, people naturally stay silent to avoid retaliation. To solve the case, he kept visiting, hoping for a witness. Later, surveillance footage from 2 a.m. showed 3 people in the elevator, a woman from the 4th floor and Old Han from the 6th. The third, a simpleton, often stole newspapers. The bold detective tried questioning the woman and Old Han, but neither were home. Returning, Old Han noticed a man in black following him. Suspecting the murderer, he hurried toward the complex. As the killer staged an accident, the detective emerged and met Old Han, ruining the plan.
It's even harder to make a judgment. He saw the killer staring right at him.
Terrified, Old Han claimed that he was drunk that night and insisted he didn't know anything. At the same time, he silently prayed in his heart, hoping the killer would spare him. However, with years of investigative experience, the bald detective immediately judged from Old Han's anxious expression that he was lying. Then he took out his phone and asked Old Han to identify the suspect in the photo. But just as Old Han leaned in to take a look, a colleague suddenly called the bald detective, saying they had just found out the killer's identity. Upon hearing this, the bald detective didn't dare linger and hurried back to the police station. This left Old Han feeling suspicious. The killer's earlier appearance could only be described as ghostly and elusive. For someone so cautious, could the police really have identified him so quickly? That night, the bald detective led a team to corner the suspect in an underground parking garage. The man turned out to be Mailing's ex-boyfriend, the victim. He had been making a living by stealing cars, and after Mailing repeatedly tried to persuade him to change his ways without success, she broke up with him. On the night Mailing was murdered, she had called the police, saying her ex-boyfriend had been stalking her. So the police suspected that the ex-boyfriend killed Mailing. But just as the ex-boyfriend finally caught his breath, his phone suddenly rang. When he took it out to look, he was shocked to see that it was Mailing, calling.
If it doesn't work, just ask if it doesn't work. Sorry, but just as...
It was because of this phone call that the ex-boyfriend exposed his location. She had just realized something was wrong, but unexpectedly, the killer had already appeared behind her. After knocking the ex-boyfriend unconscious, the killer staged it to look like a suicide by poisoning. The next day, the news announced that the case had been solved. First, it was said that Mailing had broken up with her ex-boyfriend, so he harbored resentment and killed her. Finally, during the police pursuit, the ex-boyfriend supposedly poisoned himself to avoid facing justice. The bald man who saw this news was furious. How could someone desperately fleeing for their life suddenly commit suicide by poisoning? He knew that this was all because the higher-ups were eager to claim credit, so they went along with it and hastily closed the case, making the ex-boyfriend the scapegoat. So,
he said, simultaneously at that very same moment, Old Han also began to notice something quite strange and unusual happening on his end.
covering the suspect's forehead with his phone. He realized it wasn't the killer. Han hoped staying silent would end things, but his fourth-floor neighbor approached him. She saw the crime and knew the police had the wrong man. Since the real culprit was now stalking her, she insisted Han help her report it.
How can this be over? Maybe keep him still. Don't let that big bad wolf get away. Oh, right. Come with us. Where? To the police station. It's too scary alone. Although the woman with the long hair seemed to be...
She realized that Lao Han was also a witness, but considering her family's safety, she still chose to play dumb. Seeing that the other party wouldn't stop talking, Lao Han directly forced the long-haired woman to leave. Little did she know, this action would soon cost her her life. Just as she stepped into the elevator, the killer immediately followed her in. Seeing that familiar and vicious face, the long-haired woman was so terrified she didn't even dare to breathe. She thought for sure the killer was going to silence her. Reaching the fourth floor, he stepped out and saw the other person hadn't moved. Watching the elevator descend, he finally sighed in relief. The killer had only waited to avoid the elevator's surveillance. But as he entered his door code, the killer was already right behind him. Meanwhile, Old Han found the long-haired woman's phone at her doorstep. When he picked it up, he saw it was her husband calling. As he approached the long-haired woman's door, he noticed it wasn't closed, which made him curious. So he looked inside and discovered that the long-haired woman had already become a corpse, while the killer was calmly cleaning up the scene. Before Old Han could react, the long-haired woman's husband called again. Realizing she had been exposed, the killer immediately bolted toward the stairwell. Hearing the commotion, the killer quickly gave chase. Because Old Han was running so fast, he had just stepped out the door when he ran into the railing, causing the long-haired woman's phone to fall down as well. Panicked, Old Han wanted to seek help from the security guard, but found that there was no one inside. He picked up the phone and was about to call the police when suddenly he heard his daughter's voice behind him. Seeing Old Han put down the phone, the killer quietly walked away as well, indicating that he wouldn't harm his family. But just as Old Han rushed over to his wife and daughter, the bald man suddenly arrived and then took out a photo of the scapegoat. Just as Old Han was hesitating whether to tell the truth, the killer, who was hiding behind a pillar, appeared again and stared fiercely at Old Han's daughter.
Nobody told him to go for the ticket. Ugh, it's so annoying thinking of the police.
Previously, the police closed the case hastily without a thorough investigation, and if he admitted to being the witness, his family could be in danger at any time. After much inner struggle, Old Han still decided to play dumb and pretend he didn't know anything.
Here, no matter what happens later, you can't curse it. He never comes back, you know.
China is forcing me right now, hey?
Hearing Old Han shout so firmly and forcefully, the murderer finally left the scene slowly. That day, just as Old Han was about to go to work, he was suddenly stopped by a stranger. When he saw the missing person notice, he realized that the man in front of him was the husband of the long-haired woman. Isn't that the one who was poisoned by the raw materials? Feeling guilty, Old Han was afraid he might accidentally reveal the truth, so he brushed off the conversation with a few words and hurriedly left. Little did he know, danger would soon come upon him. Since the bald man couldn't get any clues from the eyewitness, he changed the direction of his investigation. First, he found tire tracks on the hillside above the neighborhood. Then, after carefully checking surveillance footage, he discovered a suspicious vehicle that had been stolen a month earlier. But by the time they found the car in the wilderness, it had already been burned by the murderer. Fortunately, after a thorough search, the apprentice found the charred memory card from the dashcam. Once it was repaired, they checked the recorded footage on the card and finally pinpointed the location to a residential area. After several hours of staking out, they indeed spotted a suspicious individual. Even though he was just returning to his own home, he kept looking around furtively, clearly afraid of being followed. Although the bald man was basically certain that the man in black was the murderer, the evidence they had wasn't enough to arrest him. They needed an eyewitness to overturn the confession, but the long-haired woman from the fourth floor had already disappeared, and Old Han refused to cooperate. In the end, he could only pin his last bit of hope on but when he found this person, he discovered that it had also been killed. Left with no other choice, he went back to Old Han and warned him. Hearing this, Old Han's defenses immediately crumbled. He couldn't hold back any longer, and soon went with the bald man to the chief's office, where he revealed everything he knew. Now that they had Old Han's testimony, the bald man didn't dare delay, and immediately led the police team to arrest the murderer. Since he had already assigned someone to keep watch, he knew the murderer was at home at that moment. But when he went up to the second floor and saw the murderer, he noticed something odd. The microwave was running with something inside. The bald man instantly sensed that something was wrong. Taking advantage of the chaos, the murderer decisively jumped out the window and escaped. When Old Han learned that the arrest operation had failed, it was like a bolt from the blue. Realizing that his wife and daughter could be in danger at any moment, he hurriedly took a taxi home. But just as he left, a black sedan began tailing him. Sensing that something was wrong, the bald man decided to send his apprentice to protect Old Han's family. After passing several traffic lights, Old Han also realized he was being followed. So when the taxi reached an intersection, he suddenly grabbed the steering wheel from the driver, causing the car to swerve and shake off the tailing vehicle. However, just as he was secretly rejoicing, he didn't expect the other party to come driving the wrong way from the intersection ahead. Seeing this, Old Han hurriedly told the driver to reverse. Just as he was about to run away, he was immediately grabbed by the long-haired woman's husband, and the two started fighting. The reason he attacked Old Han was because the murderer had lied on the phone, claiming that his wife was still alive and that Old Han had witnessed everything. The murderer told him that as long as he killed Old Han, his wife would be allowed to go home. However, just as Old Han was about to be strangled to death, the bald man who had been chasing them arrived in time and fired his gun to stop the man in the hat. At this point, Old Han couldn't worry about anything else. He jumped straight into the bald man's car and sped away. All he wanted now was to get home as quickly as possible. He wanted to make sure his wife and daughter were safe. Meanwhile, the bald man's apprentice had already arrived at Old Han's house. Just as he knocked on the door, the murderer, who had been lying in wait for a long time, rushed out. Seeing what was happening, Old Han's wife immediately ran back to the bedroom and locked the door. Then, she hid their daughter in the wardrobe and told her not to make a sound before using the dressing table to block the door. But for the ruthless killer, this was useless. He first broke the lock, then used all his strength to kick the door open. As the saying goes, a woman becomes strong when she is a mother. Since there was no way to escape, she decisively grabbed an iron and confronted the killer head-on. Just when she had nowhere left to retreat, the daughter heard her mother's screams and came out, drawing the killer's attention. Seeing this, the wife hurriedly told her to run out and call the police. When the killer tried to chase after her, she clung tightly to his leg to buy her daughter some time, but the killer grabbed her and slammed her hard onto the floor. When the killer chased after the daughter again, he decisively picked up the hammer on the ground and smashed it directly onto the killer's ankle, then struck another blow to the knee before hurriedly running out in a panic. But just as he found his daughter, the enraged killer caught up, swung the hammer, and threw it at them. No matter how loudly his wife shouted, no neighbors came out. In the end, the mother and daughter were cornered by the killer. Just as the killer was about to strike a fatal blow, two moving workers suddenly came out of the elevator, and right after, a middle-aged couple passed by outside the door. Seeing more and more residents gathering to watch, the killer limped away from the scene. Meanwhile, Old Han finally rushed back. Seeing his wife and daughter in such a miserable state, he knew he couldn't keep being a coward, so he mustered up his courage and made a bold decision. Seeing the killer running up the mountain, he immediately followed. When he reached halfway up, he kicked down the landslide warning sign and used it as a weapon for self-defense, then engaged in a life-or-death struggle with the killer. Since the opponent was a seasoned murderer and Old Han had no fighting experience, he was quickly overpowered. Just as he was about to be beaten to death, in a moment of desperation, he bit down hard on the killer's arm and refused to let go, no matter how much the killer struck him. When the killer finally broke free with all his strength, he realized a chunk of flesh was missing from his arm. Seeing the killer launch another attack, Old Han instinctively grabbed a sapling nearby, yanked it out by the roots, and smashed it with all his might onto the killer's forehead. Seeing the killer collapse to the ground, he then straddled him, raised his fist, and pounded it down onto the killer's head, unleashing all the pent-up demons inside him from these past days. However, what he didn't notice was that the torrential rain had already triggered a landslide. Before Old Han could even steady himself, he was swept away by a mudslide. Old Han woke up, he saw a woman in front of him. As he approached to take a closer look, he realized it was the long-haired woman from the 4th floor. Then he looked around and saw corpses everywhere. Without exception, all of them had died from head injuries. From this, he deduced that this must be the killer's burial ground. Although Old Han had narrowly escaped with his life, the killer wasn't so lucky. His abdomen had been pierced straight through by a tree trunk, leaving him completely immobilized, as if he had been nailed to the ground. Afterwards, Old Han called the police and left the matter to them. Later, Old Han learned from the bald man. The police found more than 20 bodies on the mountain in total. Old Han wanted to know the killer's motive, but the bald man told him there was no reason. It's just like how some people like to gamble and others like to drink, but this killer simply liked to rape and murder women. As soon as Old Han left the hospital, he immediately contacted a moving company. He wanted to take his wife and daughter to a new place and start over. Before leaving, he stood at the spot where Mei Ling was killed and shouted for help several times. He wanted to know if, should something like this happen again, someone righteous would step forward. Although many residents had their lights on, Old Han waited a long time but received no response. Perhaps those residents were thinking the same way Old Han once did. If they stepped in to help and something happened to them, what would become of their own families? Who would pay the mortgage then? That's where today's story ends.